I want to ask you a question about algorithmic drift, how we take back our power from algorithmic drift.
The very nature of drift is not necessarily just algorithmic. It's also to do with your brain. If you have outsourced your thinking to the machine, you also might be outsourcing your life in general. I can hold an idea for a week and write 1,000 words, but holding multiple strands with multiple stories and try and weave that into a narrative to get across a certain idea, I found very difficult. And I believe that the framework that I've put together it's just powerful for humans. There's a simplicity behind it that people can get behind and realize the importance of human skills that they need. But also at the same time, the world is moving and these skills will move with them if they treat them seriously.
I'm Zoe Weil, and this is Solutionary Voices, a podcast brought to you by the Institute for Humane Education, an organization helping to build a more compassionate, just, and healthy world for all people, animals, and the ecosystems that support life. On this podcast, we bring together guests on the forefront of addressing local and global challenges and whose lives, ideas, and actions we hope will inspire you to find your own solutionary path. Today I'm speaking with Rahim Hirji, author of the new book, Super Skills, The 7 Human Skills for the Age of AI, as well as the Box of Amazing newsletter. Rahim's goal is clear and essential. Help people and organizations stay human in the age of intelligent machines. Amen to that, and welcome, Rahim.
Thank you, Zoe. Really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
We always begin the podcast with asking guests, what problem are you working to solve?
A couple of things I'd say is that I probably hit a few roads by accident. I chose my career based on what I thought was the best training, and I went into banking, absolutely hated it, and had to find a way to meander out, trying to find my own calling. The question for me then was really about, how do you find what the problem is that you need to solve? And very early in my career, I thought that was within the media space, because I thought that I'd be able to impact people in that area. And then by chance got into education and very quickly realized that this was a space that I wanted to play in. It was a place where, even though I'm not an educator, I'm not a teacher, it was a place where I knew that I could impact individuals. And so when you think about the problem that I'm trying to solve, there have been many problems along this route that I've been in. Firstly, just by getting into it, you realize that you can change people's life trajectory. That's quite a powerful thing to realize when you understand that someone's life could be very much different in 10 or 20 years' time if you have the right impact earlier on. But similarly, you can help others who have had a great trajectory already by topping up a little bit on top with tutoring. And some of my early parts of my career was in online tutoring, when it seemed like a very weird thing to have someone on the other end of the internet teach your child maths, for example, or math, I think as you call it in the US. My last kind of 2 or 3 years has been all around trying to understand how AI is affecting people. And I've seen it, I see very clearly that it's been done in the wrong way. And so I find now my calling is to open up people's eyes to the fact that whilst AI is so powerful for us as the human race, that it allows us to be more human. Really, what I'm trying to do here is open people's eyes up to opportunities, to missteps that have happened along the way. People are drifting to rely on algorithms and technology more so than they should be doing. And I feel that's my calling. And that's the problem that I'm trying to solve.
Thank you for all of that. And we're going to go to your book in a little bit, because I want to hear why you wrote Super Skills. But before we go there, I want to talk about the letter that you wrote to your daughter when she went off to college last year. And you published this letter on your Substack. And I thought it was quite extraordinary. And I also think I I was struck by it because I once wrote a 5-page letter to my son when he was a sophomore in high school, and he was making some not so great decisions. And writing that letter was one of my better parenting moments. And he's read that letter a few times as an adult, in addition to reading it when he was a teenager. And it made me wonder what inspired you to write your letter to your daughter and how she responded to it and how she felt about you sharing that letter with the world.
For me, it was a very selfish thing in the beginning because, we've talked about time before, so, right? So I always feel as if we're running out of time, and, life is a finite thing. And parenthood is I know it's a lifetime thing once you have kids, but it's a finite period when you have your child or your children at home. There are exams in the way, there's life is in the way, and all of the things that I wanted to say, I knew there wasn't going to be a time that I could say it in the right way, and probably in the most appropriate way for my daughter. And so I wanted, very selfishly, to make sure that I'd given the right pieces of advice from my perspective. And, we're not all knowing, but I wanted to give it from my perspective on mistakes that I've made. And you'll know that I talked about failure in that letter, but also the opportunities that come ahead. I don't think you can think about that and say, I'm going to do that in one conversation, or plan it out in your head that I'm going to have a Sunday walk 5 weeks in a row and trying to have these conversations, because life does get in the way. And so I sat over, I think, of 6 months, and I would just keep coming back to it and adding bits and pieces as I was thinking. And I told a couple of friends about it, and they said, because oh, I wish I could do that. And I didn't quite understand when they said, I wish I could do that. I thought everyone could do that. Everyone could write a letter. Everyone can say what they want to say and say what they wanted to think. And when I realized that actually not everyone can write a letter and think about some of these deep things, or necessarily have the right time to do it, I thought I need to try and make this open enough so that people who are going through the same thing, and it happens to every parent at some point, that their child will leave them. He always may come back, but the child is going off to a new phase in their life. And I just thought, let me try and write this on a personal perspective for myself, selfishly, but also share that thought process with others, whether they wanted to write their own letter or whether they wanted to just use the wisdom that I felt that I had to give and tailor it a little bit for themselves. And so I made this very late decision that I was going to just share it and publish it. In the next few days, after having made that decision and published it widely on, I think it was on LinkedIn and also on my Substack, I had so much outpouring of gratitude that I know that, if you're thinking about impact, that I'd had impact on so many parents who wouldn't have known what to say. And they said, is it okay if I cut and paste bits and pieces of this? And I said, of course, absolutely. That's the reason why I put it. To be brutally honest, I mean, I think at some points when I was writing that letter, I would cry. So you would write these things, and I didn't know what was happening to me. I'm not sure if that was because my own daughter was leaving, but I'd be in tears writing this stuff. And I didn't write it with my wife, but I let her read it before we shared it. And she had obviously her own way of communicating with her daughter, and that was equally emotional. But in my own way, my wife read it and she was saying, "This is beautiful. This is exactly what I wanted to say, and you've been able to say it, and I want to say something slightly different, and I'm going to say that in my own way." But she was in tears. And friends who I hadn't spoken to in many years, they were messaging me and saying, "Haven't seen you in 10 years or since university. Why the swear word are you making me cry?" And so it was a kind of a link point, and also to people who haven't got kids. Those people reached out to me, and also complete strangers. It's complete strangers were sending me these notes, and it was a little bit overwhelming actually, to get all of these messages from people. But I felt at that point, having done that one, I think I'd done the good thing for my daughter, because she has that artifact for her. At that point, going into university, she'll have that artifact as she comes out of university, and hopefully she'll have that artifact that she can pass on to her own kids in a certain way. So I knew I'd done that, but also I know I'd made this impact because of the people who had messaged me directly.
Well, it's an extraordinary letter, and we'll put Box of Amazing, your Substack newsletter, in the show notes. So, because I imagine there are going to be people now who really want to read it. One of the pieces of advice that you gave to her was meet people utterly unlike you, and I loved that piece of advice for my own reasons, and I'm wondering what your reasons were for putting that there.
I think that was a failure of my university life and my early career, was that I was drawn to people who were similar to me. I was a bit of I studied computer science, bit of a nerd. I liked people who liked the same music as me, and was a little bit less experimental in those years, because I think I was still finding myself. And I wish people had said, go and do things. And I think people had said, go and do things that you haven't done before. But I just was closed to listening to that. And that was the reason for me to do that, because I saw so much opportunity in being able to meet completely different people, to just be rich in people's opinions, in different personalities, in growing yourself because of people's different personalities, because of people's different experiences, and learning from them, and then widening your view of the world. And I think it was a game changer for my daughter, because she's doing this course where there's two parts to it. There's a history part and there's an innovation part. So I said to her, join every single club going, even if you don't want to do it. And she was saying, oh, it costs £10 to join this one, I'm not going to go to it. I said, just go to every single one, we'll pay for all of them, and then go to all of them. And if you don't like it, then don't go again, but at least you've tried. And so we signed up for every single thing that she could sign up for. And then, and so in that first week, I think we call it Freshers Week here in the UK, that she went to every single club, or whatever they're called. Then she went to her history social. Then she went to her history and innovation social. And then the innovation part of her course, so this is vaguely specific, had links with other faculties. So there might be a geography with innovation. So she met these people doing those parts of the course. But also she got to meet people in geography and people in computer science, et cetera. So by the time she'd gone through all of these socials, and she's a little bit like me. I think she's an introvert of sorts. She'd really stepped out of her comfort zone. And in that first 2 weeks, first 3 weeks of university, you're allowed to be someone else. You can reset. And I said, there's not very many places that you can, in your life, that you can reset. You can reset when you go to a new school, when you go to a new university, perhaps when you start a new job. You can step out of your comfort zone and try and be someone else. And you can do this later on in life, but it becomes more difficult because you are kind of set in your own ways, and it's very difficult to step out of that. I'm sure there's some science behind it as well. But if you were able to do that earlier, the world is your oyster. And what she said to me at the end, she goes, I'm glad you gave me that advice, because when we were going out with her roommates from, I think after about a month, she would bump into people in the street and everyone knew her. And that's great for a young person, right? And all her flatmates were saying, how do you know all of these people? And so she became this kind of center of attention, and she knows people. And I said, you may not choose to be friends with these people long term. They may just be acquaintances for you. But, in 3 years' time, you might need them as a friend, or use them as network, or they may become good friends as you grow and as they grow. But equally, you can learn from them, and they will learn from you, and you may have very different opinions on certain things, and you'll be able to argue that out to get to a point where you believe in something so strongly that you agree to disagree.
I love that that's what your daughter took away from your lessons, or one of the many things, and immediately saw the value in it. So it's just beautiful. All right, let's move on to your book, Super Skills. And the book seems different from your career trajectory. So what made you write this book?
From the outside, it doesn't look like a natural trajectory. Going through EdTech for all of this time, and then doing this physical artifact or about human skills. But actually, if I go back 10, 15 years now, it all comes from a point in time where two things happened for me. And the startup that I kind of co-founded was a business called EtonX. And we founded that business in China. And I'd never been to China before. I'd been to Hong Kong, and it was a big change for me. New culture, new type of people, new way of doing business, very fast. Fast lights, it was there was a big city, and I was a little bit out of my comfort zone. But what I found there was two things. One, there was an opportunity for the business that we were building, which was teaching soft skills, and I'd seen kids in China, and they were very, very bright. They were excelled at maths and science and some of the hard skills. And I think at the time, and it was in the press, and this became part of the raison d'etre for the program that we built. They didn't have this area which they called in China, they called them leadership skills. As I looked at that, I saw that this is an opportunity, and the World Economic Forum and PISA and people weren't really talking about that at the time, and it's only become prominent over the last 5-10 years, where people are talking about critical thinking, and everyone talks about critical thinking these days, but no one was really talking about it in detail at that point in time. And so that set me on this path to let's build the best possible program for these teenage kids, and that meant researching these skills, critical thinking, creativity, and a bunch of leadership, teamwork, all of the things that we know now to be really important. But on the other side, there was this other thing that happened, because I'd studied computer science, and I thought I was ahead of the game, maybe arrogantly, but going into China, into Shanghai, and meeting large organizations, Alibaba and Tencent, and some of these startups there, I suddenly saw that machine learning had taken this step up. And I hadn't seen that in the UK or in Europe or in the West, but I was seeing it very clearly in China. And so when I looked at that, I was saying, okay, well, I've read about artificial intelligence for so long, but this is it in a real way, and it's happening in this country. So it's only going to be a matter of time before this is going to hit the West. And so what I did at that point was I tried to read as much as I could around this subject, and a lot of it was very technical, and trying to figure it out. And before I knew it, I'd forgotten what I'd learned. And as we know, is in the education field, the best way to learn something is to teach someone else. And that's how I actually started off Box of Amazing, my newsletter. This was in service to myself again, almost being selfish again, but at the same time I was helping other people to learn areas which I thought were important. And one day it was AI, one day it was machine learning, one day it was blockchain. Some days it was a trend that I saw. I think there was one that was Kit Kat sushi. So things that I found really interesting, I would just write about and talk about, and I would share the reading that I'd done. I've been doing that now for 10 years. And so these kind of things came together again. So this thing in China in 2013, and here we are in 2024, 25, 26. They kind of came back together again, because if I hadn't done my newsletter, I wouldn't have been able to build the muscle to be able to write. And I could write a newsletter, and it took me a while to get the right type of cadence once a week, the right type of style, and trying to get people to understand things and make it engaging enough. But it's very difficult to do that on a regular basis, and you build your muscle. And then you've got to take another step to be able to build a book. And as you know, so it's a tough thing to do, it nearly killed me, because it was so difficult to cognitively hold some of those ideas in your head. I can hold an idea for a week and write 1,000 words, but holding multiple strands with multiple stories, and try and weave that into a narrative to get across a certain idea, I found very difficult. And then, so if you think about that, that's the writing muscle and getting things across. And then as I was researching this with organizations and speaking to them, I realized that the things that I'd been thinking about when I was in China, about what could be the next skills that we needed to learn, and is there a model that we can build for that? Is it too early then, or is it too early now? And that's where the framework came from. So in this very weird way, having had this opportunity to go to China set me on this path for this book that I'm doing now. And I only realized that very recently. You know, I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to go to China and see the world at that point in time, because now I can see the linkages, I can see the things that are happening. And I believe that the framework that I've put together is powerful. It's powerful for humans. There's a simplicity behind it that people can get behind and realize the importance of human skills that they need. But also at the same time, the world is moving, and these skills will move with them if they treat them seriously.
So we're going to get into the skills in a bit, but you just said writing that book almost killed you. But last week in your Substack, in Box of Amazing, you said writing the book may have saved your life. So what did you mean by that?
I think if I didn't have anything to hold on to, I might have continued to struggle. And my readers will know, and my friends and family obviously know, that I went through some serious health conditions before and during writing that book. And having gone into a hospital midway through writing the book, not because of the book, but midway through writing the book, I came out of it and lost my way a little bit. Because when you're it's like being on the motorway. If you stop for a bit, you lose your kind of footing, and you need to get back to your speed again. And I actually didn't want to start, and I was pretty depressed about what had happened to me from a health perspective. I felt very sorry for myself, and I found it very difficult to get back into the thinking of holding all of those things cognitively. But I knew that was a thing that I needed to do, and the output of that would help individuals. And I knew that I could probably work on myself, but I knew that if I did and continued and fixed the book to be as good as it could be, and it's never going to be perfect, but as good as it could be, that I would be helping myself and helping others at the same time. And I'm lucky that I had it, so because in progressing in a recovery, you need something to hold on to.
I'm struck by the thing that almost killed you, saved your life, and that when we have meaning and purpose, which your book was providing to you, and then, of course, is now going to be available to the world, that meaning and purpose just gets amplified. I want to ask you a question about algorithmic drift, because you talk about that in your book and on your Substack. the quiet outsourcing of judgment to machine-made choices. And I'd love for you to unpack what you mean by algorithmic drift for our audience. And then I'm going to ask you a question about how we take back our power from algorithmic drift.
Drift and design is the central premise of the book, and it's not a skill, but it's an underlying area that you need to think about. The easiest way to describe algorithmic drift to people is: are you sure when you go to Netflix, or you go to Google, or you go to Google Maps, or you step foot in a new city, that it has been built in the best possible way for you? Or is there an inkling in your head that it could be built for someone else, or someone else's profit, or for the flow of traffic, or for some other reason? And we've seen algorithms in our lives for many years, and it's only because AI has now come to the forefront that this becomes even more important. For example, I know many people now who will default their thinking to these great superpowers that we have available to us. You have Claude, you have ChatGPT, Grok, Copilot, whatever tool of choice that you want to use. A lot of people I know are just going straight into that without thinking themselves. And I call that concept drift. And the very nature of drift is not necessarily just algorithmic. It's also to do with your brain. If you have outsourced your thinking to the machine, you also might be outsourcing your life in general. You choose to do. You choose to pick up your phone the first thing when you wake up. What happened with that? We didn't have phones 20, 30 years ago, but now this phone sits right next to us next to our bed. I'm guilty of it. I'm not sure if you are, but many people are. And should the first thing that you do is, hug your loved one, or meditate, or breathe deeply, or have a glass of water, which probably should be, but most people go to the phone. And there are hundreds of examples of that drift into our society. Where I'd love people to go is to understand there's a level of agency around that. And you can choose not to be a sleepwalker, which is what I call it in the book. You can choose not to be a sleepwalker and have that level of agency where you can step out of it. You can also some people don't realize that there is this happening, and they are very efficient at doing things. I love the book Atomic Habits, but if you just think about atomic habits and the things that you might do without realizing there's algorithms in play, you become this concept that I call programmed. You're very good at doing the things, but you're actually not sure who you're being controlled by. And so that's very dangerous as an individual, as in humanities, and we've seen it in history, being programmed by others. And so I'd love for people to take a step back, look at that concept, and say, I'm going to take matters into my own hands and become a designer of my own life that's going to be beneficial to me and to others. And that's really what the concept of the book is, and that's where things like the super skills sit, where concepts like judgment sit, because I believe it's to be such a critical point right now that if we don't do anything about it, we'll fall into all being drifters or sleepwalkers.
And it's so incredibly hard, which is bizarre. I didn't have a phone that was my own phone with my own phone number. It was attached to a cord for most of my life. And I have managed to not pick up my phone first thing in the morning, but the only way I'm able to do it is if I've made a very conscious commitment not to do it for a month or a period of time. Like this month, I will not do this. And then I'm able to sort of stick with it. But if I don't make that commitment every month, it just drifts back. So it's really, really hard. So let's talk about those super skills that you named. So you named 7 human super skills: curiosity, change readiness, big picture thinking, empathy, global adaptability, principled innovation, and augmented mindsets. And I'd love to hear how you landed on these 7 and what skill you think you're best at.
So there's a couple of things here. One, I have spoken to individuals at organizations for quite a while. So there's been a lot of research in trying to understand what companies are doing, how they think about things, speaking to lots of chief people officers and chief HR officers, as well as individuals within the organizations who are doing different parts of the work. So some might be in product, some might be in finance, some might be in operations, some might be on the front line. Just to really understand what people do, what they see as important, and which companies are doing well and which companies are not doing well. Now, I'm not an academic researcher, so a lot of this was just me grouping things up together and figuring things out. A lot of pattern matching to understand where things come to. There were, a long list of 20 skills that I ended up with. And I looked at them. Some had sub skills and they kind of came together, and I got to I got to kind of a lower number. And then I consulted with the actual experts, World Economic Forum, McKinsey. There's a bunch of these reports that you kind of look at. And broadly, the work that I'd done aligned very much with the work that these proper researchers had done. Except I found them not very accessible. So they've kind of listed the things there, and there's not very much around what you might need to do as an individual. Maybe within an organization it was great, but not as an individual. It was tricky to think about it, and you need to learn about these things with stories and examples and failures and wins. And so I took my 10, got them down to 7, figured out which were actual skills and which were traits that sit within that. And that's how I got to my 7. And, there were points where I was sitting, okay, what am I going to do? I've got to 8, and I think 7 is probably right. 3 is too little. Where do I go with? I'm going to give you an exclusive today. my 8th skill that I decided to drop was relationships. And it's not that I don't believe it important, because I think it's actually weaves itself across all of these skills, right? But it's just something that I think it sits there along with things like judgment. So that's, there's no proper science behind getting to the 7 skills, but when you speak about these 7 skills and when you explain them to others, people will say to me, that 100% makes sense to me right now and what I'm going through. And when I did say it, maybe when I first came up with the list, maybe 2 years ago, I think people were a bit, I'm not quite sure. They say AI can have empathy. And when you speak to them about it now, and I think people have moved on and have got, a kind of clarity around it, that they're saying, yeah, this feels right, and I want to learn more about these skills and how I translate them for myself in my daily life, but also for my team, but also for my family. I would say that this is probably the most asked question that I get over the last month, when I've kind of come out a little bit more overtly about the 7 skills. I mean, I'd say, instead of answering of those 7 skills, I'd say I've got a slightly different skill to step out of that. And I only recognized this when I had a conversation with Rudy.
And I'll interrupt to say that Rudy has been on this podcast, Rudy Carson, and he's also your cousin.
We speak intermittently. And when I was talking to him about what I was doing, he put his finger on, it's almost like he put his finger on the button. And he said, you're the translator at Babel. And I was like, huh? What do you mean I'm the translator at the Babel? And he said, well, you sit in between all of these people and you like tell everyone what this means. And I didn't quite understand him at the time, but I've done some thinking around that area. And you know what? I'm not the smartest in the room when I go and speak to the academics. I'm not the smartest in the room when I go and speak to the tech people. Or I'm not the smartest in the room when you go and speak to the chief people officers. All of them have got a level of expertise. Even people in the workplace, right? So people who are doing their jobs, they've all got this level of expertise, but they all have this different AI hat on them. So, the CEO will have, I don't know, we're looking at either revenue opportunities or cost cutting or process. That's the hat that he'll have. The chief people officers or people in HR will be thinking about what can we do for our individuals in the organization in this new world. And finance people will be looking about cost cutting. You're looking at the academics, are looking at all of the research to try and predict what's going to happen in the future because we've got no blueprint for the world that we're going into. And so I think I sit in between all of those areas in that I understand each of these prongs, but I'm not an expert in either of them. But a chief HR officer is not an expert in any of the other areas. Maybe some of them are, but I sit there as a very good generalist and connector in all of these different areas, which is I don't know how Rudy was able to do it, but he put his finger on it without me even realizing it. And I think that's my super skill, which doesn't sit my 7, the translator of Babel, which is, sorry, that's a cop-out answer, but that's the one that resonated with me recently.
So this is the Solutionary Voices podcast, and I want to talk about your 6th super skill, which is principled innovation, in the context of solutionary thinking and action. So a solutionary brings this ethical imperative to solving problems and transforming systems, to do so in a way that does the most good and the least harm for everyone, for people, for non-human animals, and for the ecosystems that sustain us. How can people who are committed to principled innovation in theory really follow through with that commitment in such a complex and interconnected, globalized world where supply chains are inevitably going to include destructive and inhumane and unjust and unsustainable systems and acts that harm people, that harm animals, that harm the environment, and that the decision maker will never even know about? How do you really do that?
I think that principled innovation is probably one of the most difficult of the skills to build into organizations. I think people who I treat people as inherently good. I know there's bad people in the world, but you give people the benefit of the doubt that they're inherently good. But when they've got a difficult decision to make, they may veer down the other route. Thinking out loud, because I think it's a very difficult question, is there are frameworks that exist, and I think frameworks are good, but they're also bad because people they look at frameworks and they think about them as a tick box. And I've had quite a lot of questions, people asking me, why don't you just call it being ethical? And my answer to them is, I'm trying to solve with these skills a position in the future or to protect individuals. And so for that to happen, you need to innovate. You need to change what we're doing. So, for example, these 7 skills are being able to innovate who we are as humans. Implementing AI is innovating an organization. But you can choose one way or you can choose the other. And, we can go back to some of the big tech things that are going on in the world. You can look at some of the the tech that sits there for teenagers and it causes addiction. But if we had said at the outset that these, from a governmental perspective, shouldn't be allowed to happen, then they wouldn't have happened. And the way that I'm looking at it now is the lens that I see it is, you'll have seen about technology being pulled from the classroom for kids, and there's examples in Australia. It's going through different judiciaries at the moment. I feel that it's a travesty that we're having to do that once these teenagers are already addicted. And so it requires a world where we are faster and we think about the good as the first thing. And I know that seems a bit of a cop-out answer, but the first premise of principled innovation is do good. And if you can't do good with the solution that you're building, then you shouldn't be doing it. We wouldn't have had technology in the classroom in a bad way. And I'm pro-technology in the right way, but having a teenager whose brain is not yet at its capacity, I think it grows until it's 25, right? And giving them this, it's like cocaine in a phone, right? That's what you're giving to these kids. It's this addiction. Why would you do that? You wouldn't give cocaine to a kid. So why do you give cocaine in a phone to a kid? That's the very, very terse example of what this is. And so taking that step back is, what is the right thing to do, and trying to get, forget politics, politics aside, is what should we be doing that ends up in a good result for everyone? Whereas what I think happens is ethics and principles come in as a layer afterwards when it's too difficult to make that decision. So you say, oh, we've got this new product, or we are taking this new product to market, and the revenue potential is millions and millions and millions. When you say at that point, but is it ethical? It doesn't matter if it's ethical, it's going to make us a lot of profit. So I'd say to try and bring principles and ethics right to the beginning as you're starting to think about solutions.
I really appreciate that. And I'm going to push a little harder on it, because I think one of the other things that happens is that it's fairly easy to be principled in one way, in one arena, while neglecting other ways. And so there's an example in that chapter of your book, and I've already mentioned it to you in email, the case of Honest Burgers deciding to make their buns gluten-free, and they're producing burgers, which are not only causing tremendous suffering to cows, but tremendous environmental degradation because of the ecological impacts of beef production, not to mention the health impacts of eating burgers in quantity, because that's unhealthy. So here there's one principled innovation, but there's all these other things that aren't even on the radar. And so do you worry that, people are going to sort of grab onto one principled perspective or commitment and just be blind to the others? And so in the end, it's really not principled innovation in a big sense.
I do worry about it, because I see things, you just open your eyes and look at society. You see the obvious stuff just happening. So, there's homelessness, and government can do stuff about that. You see parents feeding their kids with, junk food, and that might be an educational thing. There's, the honest burger thing is that quandary, right? It's a scale to some degree. Some very bad companies on one end, and who just don't even care about anything, and it's just about the supply chain. And there is this other company, it's Honest Burgers, which they still provide the burger, but they're providing the gluten-free because they believe that to be principled. And there's no balance. You can't say, oh, it's a little bit good, because if it's you've got to kind of look at the totality of it. Is okay if your principles around that company are not to even supply animal meat, then you've got to say that that's a bad company, and or maybe the way that they're doing it is very bad. And so there's different schools of thought. My thing is that, and we can agree to disagree on certain cases. My point on principled innovation is that some point there is a very easy choice for individuals, and sometimes it's education, sometimes it is, okay, we are not going to go to this burger joint, or we're not going to buy from this clothing company because they do this. And we start to see bubbles of that happening. And we need to get society behind the things that are most important. And sometimes they just don't know. And I'm not sure how much I can solve of that problem, but there are people and there are voices that are doing that good work. You're one of them.
Thank you. And I want to talk about the last super skill, augmented mindsets. In that chapter in your book, you use as an example of augmented mindsets the rescue of the 12 boys and their football coach from a cave in Thailand in 2018. And you recount the story as an example of what augmented mindsets look like. And what's really interesting, when you were talking earlier about relationships maybe being the eighth, I see relationships happening all over, all the super skills, and particularly in this story. And I'm wondering if you would recount the story briefly and explain why you consider it an example of this seventh super skill.
I've tried to do this recently, and it took a very long time. So I'm going to try and do the shortened version of it. But essentially, there were these kids who were stuck. I think they were playing football, and they were stuck in a cave. And the tide went in, and they were gonna drown. And so these specialist divers came in to rescue them. Now, there's the interesting thing about this story, and you probably saw it as you read it, is whilst this is an example of the augmented mindset, it's actually an example of all of the 7 super skills in one go. And as I was writing it, I said, okay, let me find out a little bit more to see if I can accentuate this. But it was all there. There were things around data that they needed. There were decisions that they needed to make on when to go and rescue these kids. They needed to put some of them they needed to take them underwater, so they needed to sedate them. There's all of these big decisions. They needed to get an approval from their kids, from their mothers. And so there was all of these things that kind of came together. And I think the reason why it's a good example, I mean, spoiler alert, it all went well. But the reason why it's a good example is not just because it's got the 7 super skills in there. It's because when people think about the augmented mindset, they just think about using ChatGPT and when do I use it. And I wanted to come up with a very clear example of something that happened in the past, which leveraged the brains of the individuals, leverage the skills of everyone in that circumstance to all come together and work together. Relationships, communication became very important. And ultimately, because they put all of those things together, those kids, most of them survived. And there was a diver who passed away as well. But we've got to think about augmentation not as a very binary, do I do it, do I not do it? We've got to think about it in the way that you can use it appropriately within your life and within the problems that you are solving. There is a part in the book, and the last part, which is my epilogue, and I talk about it in there as well. There's my stay in hospital, and it's a very tough time. And when you're on your kind of on your last legs, you're trying to figure things out. What are the things that become important to you? It's the relationships that you have, empathy that you get from the doctors and nurses. It's leveraging the data to be able to understand, to have a conversation on the right level. How do you innovate when you think there's a binary decision? Are there other options that you could look at which could work to the betterment of yourself and everyone else? So what I want people to think about when they think about the augmented mindset is, firstly, that there's a choice when to use AI and when not to use it. There's a choice to put yourself in the center of it and accentuate yourself rather than outsource yourself. And then there is this other way of thinking about technology or AI that allows you to come up with solutions that are very human-centric. And actually, being human-centric can lead to amazing results, because, as we know, AI is built on historic data. And the way that I try and explain AI to people who don't understand AI, and maybe this is a very crass way of doing it, but it's a very big autocorrect. So you could predict these things based on data in the past, but with these very unique scenarios, it can give you some great options to try and rescue kids from a cave, to try and support you as you make your way out of hospital, to try and solve problems in war-torn areas. But if you really put the human at the center of that, and if you put these 7 super skills as part of that solution, I think you get to a better result.
I want to circle back to education, because you talked about, that's where you began your career after the short banking stint. And it's an area where we at the Institute for Humane Education work, because we're working to transform the education system. And I'm wondering how you think the 7 super skills can be brought into the K-12 realm. And you talked earlier, it's almost like this book grew out of your seeing the needs for these skills there. And now that you've written this book and you've really created this framework and codified this, how could you see it being brought really directly and powerfully into the K-12 realm?
So I think, and I hope, that this becomes something that is instilled within kids at a very early age. And, it's not written for that perspective. It's written for adults traversing work. It's written for curious teenagers who are trying to think about the future and where they're going to be. But I really do hope that educators, parents read it and realize the importance of instilling these. They're super skills, but they're also values, and they're character values to some degree. What's good is I've seen it in some schools already. They already have these character values of curiosity and of empathy. And when you talk to heads or senior leadership teams about things like big picture thinking, they think, oh, that's an adult thing, right? And I said, well, if you apply it to kids, it can be applicable too. And in big picture thinking, as an example, I talk about different levels of altitude, right? And altitude is thinking about what you need to do in a month's time and what decisions you might make, or you might make different decisions if you're thinking about something to do in a year's time. That's very applicable to someone who's doing their first exam. How do you prepare for it? What do you need to think? What do you need to do? And some of them are learning them already. But if you were to get this across in the story-driven way that I've tried to do, to make it very accessible to people, if you're able to do that within K-12, can you imagine what great individuals we'll be bringing into the world. I know I'm biased, but what great individuals we'll be able to bring into the world. And I sit on I'm a governor at a school in London, and they already have some of these things already, and they're already doing that. And I just hope that we can do it, that people should do it. I hope that as a government minister, whether they're in the UK or US or elsewhere, sees the value of thinking about this in a different way, and how it's aligned not just for the now, it's aligned for the future. Because those kids who are in school right now, they are going to be the workforce and the leaders of tomorrow. And that's a way that countries should be thinking, is not just short-termist on how we're going to get through this AI phase or this AI era that we're going through, but how do we produce the leaders for that new era? And it's not by just doing the same stuff. We've had the same kind of curriculum and the same type of learning for years. I mean, I go to see schools, and I have been seeing schools for many years, and no matter which country you go to, the flavor is pretty similar to what I went through as a kid. It's many of them are pretty Victorian style, and we're just going back in another era. Some of them are forward thinking, but it's always that a school or an institution, not very often the country, but the school or institution is having to take a bet. They're having to take a bet because they believe very strongly in the type of leadership that these kids will need, and they're not getting the direction from up above. And so they're coming up with their own curriculum and their ways of doing things, the adjacent curriculum that they need to instill in these kids for them for the future.
I can relate so much to everything you've just said. You worked in K-12 and then wrote this book primarily for adults and, older teenagers. I did the same thing. We work in K-12. We have a framework for K-12. We believe that education is the root system underlying all other societal systems. And young people are going to both inherit and shape the future. And what are we preparing them for? And, 2 years ago, my book, The Solutionary Way, came out, and I wrote it for adults and older teens because we can't wait for the next generation. The super skills have to be offered to your readers right now, at the same time as these ideas like the solutionary framework and your super skills are brought to K-12. So I really appreciate that you wrote such an accessible book. And I loved your book. I hope people will get it and read it. And we'll close on one last question, Rahim, which is, what would you like your epitaph to be?
Oh, wow. Helped people see the way.
Helping people see the way. I love that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all that you're doing and for being a guest on this show. And I'm really excited to see the impact that your book is going to have.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate all that you do and all that you're doing for people. And I see Super Skills and the Solutionary Way as brother and sister in this new world.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Solutionary Voices and that you'll share it with others, give it a review, and subscribe. And I hope you'll also read Super Skills. It's a fantastic book, and visit Box of Amazing and read more from Rahim Hirji. And if you would like to become a solutionary yourself, I invite you to read my book, The Solutionary Way. Thanks so much.